at holding discussions and sharing experiences on topical issues relevant to monetary, banking, and financial matters. In this regard, the proceedings of this year's symposium will focus on the theme Rising African Sovereign Debt, Implications for Monetary Policy and Financial Stability. The symposium is aimed mainly at promoting the exchanges among central bank governors, policymakers, international institutions, and the academic community on the implication for rising public debt in African countries for monetary policy and financial system stability in general. Let's welcome those watching on Rwanda television, RTV, and if you wish to join the conversation, please use our official hashtag, which is AACB 2019. That's AACB 2019. We also have a mobile app, a mobile application, where all the documents have been shared. Without further ado, Right Honorable Prime Minister, we invite the Vice Chairperson of the AACB and Governor of the National Bank of Rwanda, the Honorable John Rwangombwa, to deliver his welcome remarks.
Right Honorable Prime Minister of the Republic of Rwanda, fellow ministers here present, Professor Victor Arson, Commissioner for Economic Affairs at the African Union, Honorable Tarek Amel, Chairperson of the ACB and Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt, Mr. Abe Selassie, Director of African Department at the International Monetary Fund, fellow governors, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this symposium preceding the 42nd annual meeting of the Association of African Central Banks. In a special way, I want to thank you, Right Honorable Prime Minister, for honoring us with your presence despite your very busy schedule. Your presence in this African Central Bank Symposium to represent His Excellency the President of the Republic of Rwanda further demonstrates the importance the government of Rwanda attaches to African unity. I also want to thank our main speakers of today, Mr. Abe Selassie, Director of African Department at the IMF, representing the Managing Director as our keynote speaker of today. Dr. Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Commission for Africa, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, former President of the African Development Bank and current Chair of the Board of the Global Fund, Mr. Gil Noble, Principal Advisor, Directorate General of International Relations at the European Central Bank, and Professor Beno Nduru, former Governor, Bank of Tanzania. Fellow governors, once again, thank you for granting Rwanda the honor of hosting you for this year's annual meetings and symposium. I hope you have enjoyed your stay so far and will continue to enjoy the Rwandan hospitality. Right Honorable Prime Minister, distinguished participants, following the decision of the African Heads of State in 1963, the Association of African Central Banks was founded in 1965. In line with the African Union mandate and vision, the association has objectives to promote cooperation in monetary, banking, and financial spheres on the African continent, as well as to prepare and coordinate efforts towards introducing a single currency and a common central bank for Africa. It is in that context that on an annual basis, on top of monitoring the progress in economic and monetary integration of the African continent, the central bank governors and other policymakers, international institutions, and academia take a day to discuss trending issues that concern the sustainability of economic growth and development across the continent. It is in that spirit that we gather here today for this annual symposium under the theme, The Rising African Sovereign Debt, Implications for Monetary Policy and Financial Stability. Right Honorable Prime Minister, distinguished participants, while today's theme focuses on Africa's rising sovereign debts, it should be noted that this is not a unique problem to Africa. In fact, many global economies are facing challenges of high and rising sovereign debt, as data from the IMF shows. In 2017, sovereign debt in advanced economies was averaging 266% of GDP, while that of emerging markets was at 168%. In the same year, average public debt for African continent was at 45%, with 19 countries above the 60%, the then threshold set by African Monetary Cooperation Program. Looking at the numbers, one would wonder why we had to dedicate a whole day to discuss debt when Africa's debt seems to be very low compared to the rest of the world. The structure of our economies that relies heavily on commodity exports susceptible to price shocks and the vulnerabilities associated with that, plus the nature of debt contracted by many of our countries, are some of the reasons why African sovereign debt is worth a day's business. The sharp increase of this sovereign debt from 25% 10 years ago to the 45% mentioned above is another concern. As central bankers, of course, we intend to focus our discussion today on how this increasing sovereign debt may affect the effectiveness of monetary policy as well as financial stability of our economies. Right Honorable Prime Minister, distinguished participants, while we are talking about the worrisome debt numbers across the world and in Africa in particular, basing on reports of 2017, we are meeting today at a time when the global economy is subdued and sluggish, and this may threaten to worsen these debt numbers across the world. Just last week, the IMF announced that it had revised downwards global GDP growth projections for the year 2019 and 2020 because of the likely negative impacts of trade wars between the US and China, plus the uncertainties surrounding Brexit. We have a saying in Kinyarwanda, which could literally be translated as, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. It would not be far-fetched to say that if we Africans don't put our act together, we will easily be at the mercy of the feet of the two global giants fighting each other. It's on that note that on behalf of my colleagues and through you, Right Honorable Prime Minister, I want to congratulate His Excellency President Paul Kagame and the other heads of state for this month's historic achievement of the entry into force of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, signed just a year ago here in this same building and same hall. The commitment of our leaders to unite Africa, demonstrated by this historic milestone, gives us confidence that we will solidify our continent into a rock that will stand the global economic challenges. We African Central Bank governors can only commit to you that we will collectively and individually play our part in this important journey our continent has embarked on. Right Honorable Prime Minister, distinguished participants, let me conclude by thanking the organizing committee of this meeting for the good job done so far. Special thanks to the Rwanda Convention Bureau, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and other agencies for their valuable support. I wish all of us fruitful and interactive symposium, and to my colleagues, I invite you to take time off the schedules of these meetings and explore the many attractions Kigali has to offer. Be assured of your security at any time of the day or the night and anywhere in the country. I thank you for your good attention.
Thank you, Honorable Governor. Right Honorable Governor, we now invite the Commissioner for Economic Affairs for the African Union Commission, Professor Victor Harrison, to deliver his remarks.
Excellency, Prime Minister of the Republic of Rwanda, Mr. Tarek Ahmed, Chairperson of the Association of African Central Banks and the Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt, Mr. Rawangoba John, Vice Chairperson of Association of African Central Bank and the Governor of the Central Bank of Rwanda, Mr. Abebe Amiro Selassie, African Department, International Monetary Fund, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of African Union Commission, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the government, the Central Bank of Rwanda, and the people of Rwanda for the warm and fraternal hospitality accorded to my delegation and all participants since our arrival in Kigali. Let me also take this opportunity to thank His Excellency President of Rwanda, President Paul Kagame, for his leadership on the reforms process of African Union to ensure an autonomous and efficient organization for the continent. Excellency, honorable guests, and ladies and gentlemen, before sharing my point of view on the theme in the discussions, allow me inform you that during the extraordinary Assembly of the African Union held in Niamey, Niger, the heads of state and government launched the instrument of the operational phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But is it necessary to remember that the great decision on the AFCFTA was taken in this auditorium last year? Through this launch, the continent has made steady efforts toward the establishment of the African Economic Community and with a single currency as stated in Abuja Treaty. The AFCFTA constitutes today the largest free trade area in terms of numbers of participating countries. It covers a market of 1.2 billion people and a GDP of $2.5 trillion. Consolidating this continent into one trade area provides great opportunities for trading enterprises, businesses, and consumers across Africa, and the chance to support sustainable development in the region. However, it is critical that Africa diversifies its economy in order to yield the full potential of AFCFTA by moving away from commodities such as oil and minerals, which have traditionally accounted for most of Africa's exports, towards a more balanced and sustainable export based on the improve intra-African trade. Furthermore, the establishment of African financial institutions become an imperative as they constitute a prerequisite for successful implementation of AFCFTA and the vehicles that will drive the continent's financial sector with a view to financing infrastructure deficits on the continent and facilitating productive transformation and trade among countries. Excellencies, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, with regard to the creation of African Monetary Union with a single currency, ECOWAS has shown us the right direction with the creation of ECO in 2020. Africa has more than 40 currencies, which are characterized by their volatility, illiquidity, and rarely traded status on the global financial market, which makes trading among African countries difficult. This constitutes one of the biggest barriers to the effective implementation of AFCFTA and the development of the continent. In this regard, the Commission, in collaboration with AACB, has further engaged the REICs in order to reach a consensus on the macroeconomic convergence criteria and timelines for the establishment of an African Central Bank. The Commission is planning to develop draft statutes and structure. Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, the theme of the present symposium is extremely critical for many African countries. The pace of a sovereign debt accumulation in the heavily in-debt poor countries and multilateral debt relief initiatives are now at high risk of external debt additional sources. Tax ratio to GDP in many countries is far below 20%, which is less than what is required to achieve the SDG. This leaves countries with no option other than borrowing to finance public infrastructure investments. The ASU, as long as the public investment raise potential outputs and improve economic growth. We should not be afraid to lift the threat of debt to GDP ratio from 65% to 70% in the macroeconomic convergence criteria as recommended by the last STC to enable countries to finance their development. The Commission is concerned that working together with partners, we can enhance public establishment of African.
Thank you very much, Professor. Right Honorable Prime Minister, we now invite the chairperson of the AACB and governor of the Central Bank of Egypt, Mr. Tarek Amer, to deliver his remarks.
And thank Professor Victor Harrison, Commissioner of the Economic Affairs of the African Union, for his partnership with us over the last year. Honorable governors, distinguished guests, it is the first time for me in this beautiful country, and it's quite an honor. And there have been many things that I've learned over the last 2 days, but I like to tell you, Excellency Prime Minister, that our association and my experience over the last year has been tremendous. And this association I found to be a very special convention. And with supporting it from our governments, it is going to help and be able to achieve many great results for the future of our economies. The best thing that I've seen in the meetings of the association was the trust and collaboration between the member governors. The deliberations are open and they are very candid. And if you watch with us the meetings, the hours of the meetings, and now everybody with a lot of passion, trying to speak not on behalf of their countries, but on behalf of Africa. I think with this group of special policymakers, we can do a lot. The aspirations of our people from the central banks and from the mandate that has been given to the AACB, the mandate it has put on itself, and from the African Union, in order to work on a unified African currency, unified central bank, which is of a tremendous challenge, actually is the aspiration of our people. People back home, they keep asking me and the media, when are you going to achieve that? And any policy has to be drafted and executed to achieve the sentiment of the people of the nations. The communication between our countries and through the policymakers, the flow of information and the common trust is the way forward in order for our nations to get together economically. We have watched over the last years and the statistics in terms of the benchmarks required to achieve unity, that many countries have made tremendous strides and progress in achieving the macroeconomic indicators that we have set for ourselves. And we've been very pleased to see this kind of progress. And we are trying to watch that this continue to be consistent so that we can move forward. And we have been having deliberations about why shouldn't we start considering implementing it by clusters, on stages, gradually, rather than waiting for everybody to meet the convergence criteria. We've been also discussing very important matters like illicit financing, the flows that go out of Africa, corruption and funds that are really affecting our economy in a very negative manner, KYC standards, and how to unify the way we are looking at our financial flows and managing our financial systems, and trying to safeguard financial stability. The collaboration we have between ourselves and the collaboration and understanding of our governments of the role of central banks is key for central banks to be able to safeguard our economies and our people from future crises. If we talk today about the external debt and the challenges for monetary policy and financial stability, it's a very important topic, but most importantly is that we don't feel that we are a threat right now, and we feel that our ratios are not that alarming, but we have learned that we be preemptive. We learn from previous crises that we have to be preemptive and don't wait too late in order to take the right policy actions. The support of governments and understanding of the role of central banks in Africa and their need for autonomy in order to implement macroeconomic stability decisions to safeguard inflation and financial stability is of extreme importance. And we have communicated this to Mr. Victor, Harrison, because we need this to be an awareness that's created across all policymakers in our continent. We have seen also the vision of this country and the vision of its president and the leadership and Your Excellency in looking for transparency, adopting transparency, more governance, and fighting corruption. And we believe, and from my experience back home, over the last few years, we had a tremendous crisis back in our Egyptian economy, and with the support, the political support that the central bank has achieved, and I think this is an achievement of the central bank that stands out, is that achieving the support and the buy-in of the political leadership for taking very difficult decisions that have safeguarded the economy from a tremendous crisis. The Egyptian economy has turned around in 3 years from a situation where it was threatened for its people and the community, where inflation had reached 35%. Today inflation is down to 9%, and foreign exchange regimes are back to stability, and the balance of payments has witnessed a tremendous turnaround. This political support is what our central banks need in order to achieve the mandates of our governments. So I'm sure that the deliberations of today's discussion will be very insightful to everybody, and I look forward to these deliberations and being part of the panel today. And I have a lot of enthusiasm, and I have a lot of I'm very a lot of ambition, and I'm very optimistic about our future together. And I wish the governor of the Bank of Rwanda success and good luck with his chairmanship. I congratulate him on the chairmanship of Rwanda for the AACB for the next year, and I'll be there to support in any possible manner. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our time today together.
Thank you, Governor. Right Honorable Prime Minister, we now invite the Director of the African Department at the International Monetary Fund, Mr. Abebe Selassie, to deliver his keynote address.
Good morning, Excellency Prime Minister Edouard Ngrente, distinguished governors, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me to give these opening remarks at the 42nd Annual Symposium of the AACB. It really is a very great pleasure to be among so many counterparts, colleagues, and friends. Consistent with AACB's practice of trying to identify the pressing macroeconomic challenges, I think today you've chosen for our symposium one of the most pressing issues facing central bankers and ministers in the region, which is, of course, the issue of rising public debt. As preceding speakers have noted, public debt in Africa has increased, but also across the world, as Governor Rwanda was very presciently noted earlier. This is a post-global financial crisis phenomena, and practically in all country groups, emerging markets, advanced economies, and developing countries, debt to GDP ratios have increased markedly. What is slightly different about the African case and that of emerging markets is that the interest burden of this rise in debt has gone up much more noticeably. What are the implications of this rise? And importantly, how does rising debt vulnerabilities affect the task of central banks? What does it mean for the conduct of monetary policy and the preservation of financial stability? All of us here today are in some ways grappling with these challenges. And today, I would like to share some thoughts on how to adapt to these new constraints. With previous speakers having noted quite a bit the increase in debt. I will be very brief about how it relates to Africa. First point I would like to stress is, much has been said about how significant the increase in debt has been for the region, but I would beg to stress that there's quite a lot of heterogeneity in the experience of countries. The most acute challenge with respect to debt distress is being faced by countries which were hit by the sharp decline in oil prices in particular, but also other commodity prices around 2014 and 16. These are the countries that have been most impacted by debt pressures. Elsewhere in the region, we have seen some increase in the level of debt also, but it has been part of a broader development strategy to use fiscal space for growth-enhancing investment, for example, infrastructure. Be that as it may, the key issue many countries are facing now is interest burden as a ratio to revenues in particular has increased to the levels we were observing in the early 2000s, and this is the pressing challenge for many countries. As Professor Harrison just noted, a very important part of addressing this challenge on the fiscal side is, of course, raising revenue to GDP ratios. But I would note here that even with some fiscal adjustment, country experiences show that debt to GDP ratios, it's often fiscal adjustment is sufficient to stabilize these debt levels, but it will take quite a bit of time to get debt to GDP ratios come down. As such, high debt to GDP ratios are something which are going to be with us for time to come. And of course, given this, I think it's important that we need to think about how central banks in particular need to address the challenges that this raises. For the balance of my presentation, I will focus on 5 myths on the impact of public debt on central banking that we've seen being aired recently in various contexts. The first myth is that fiscal dominance is a preoccupation of the past. This view that fiscal dominance is no longer a problem for the majority of countries in Africa is not without foundation. When we look at the traditional definition of fiscal dominance, that is direct financing of budget deficits by central banks above legal limits, this has declined over time, especially during the second half of the 2000s. Legal limits have also been tightened, and so there is less room within the legislation to put pressure on central banks to lend governments. But I think it's important to look beyond this formal consideration of fiscal dominance. If we adopt a broader view of fiscal dominance, government influence on the work of central banks, this continues to prevail. I should add here that outside the context of high public debt, pressure from governments and politicians on the activities of central banks is not a uniquely African phenomenon. Let me give you 3 examples of how this soft form of fiscal dominance manifests itself today. First, governments are often tempted to put pressure on central banks to maintain accommodative financial conditions in order to contain domestic borrowing costs. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence that point to this, and I'm sure many a central bank governor in this room has faced this pressure. A second example is fear of floating is magnified when foreign currency debt is high. In this context, there is often a desire to limit exchange rate depreciation due to currency mismatches and the negative effect on the public sector balance sheets and debt servicing costs. This tilts the balance for central banks away from using the exchange rate as a shock absorber and encourages greater intervention, possibly leading to volatility in domestic interest rates. A third example of fiscal dominance. In situations where economic growth is weak and supportive fiscal policy is constrained by high public debt, the central bank is often called to take a more proactive approach to supporting the economy. This often leads the central bank to provide subsidized lending. This may lead to the central bank to provide subsidized lending to the private sector or to troubled state-owned enterprises. More worrisome still, I think, is that high public debt can create pressure to expand the central bank mandate beyond price stability, as we are currently hearing being argued in South Africa, for example. Myth number 2. This myth that I've seen being aired notes that as long as public debt is sustainable, its level is irrelevant for monetary policy and financial supervision. There is this sense that when public debt is sustainable, little attention is needed from central banks. I would like to give some reasons as to why high public debt, even if it's sustainable, can complicate the work of central bankers significantly. First, as is well known, high public debt weakens the transmission of monetary policy. In particular, it crowds out private debt, resulting in shallow credit markets and fiscally induced pressures on interest rates. And this, of course, reduces the impact of monetary policy operations on domestic financial conditions. Another reason why high debt complicates monetary policy is because it generates more complicated trade-offs. In cases where there is high foreign currency public debt, and if there is a negative shock to the economic activity, the sovereign risk premium may increase, leading to a nominal depreciation of the currency. Monetary policy then needs to raise interest rates to limit depreciation, but this further weakens domestic growth and puts pressure on domestic government borrowing costs. This is always a tough choice to make. Finally, high public debt can create financial stability risks. A key channel in Africa is government arrears to suppliers. As we currently see in quite a few countries in the CEMAC region, banks' non-performing loans have risen significantly, partly because government arrears to suppliers prevent the private sector from repaying its bank loans. Another channel of transmission of debt to the financial sector is exposure of commercial banks to government paper. This exposure feeds the bank sovereign nexus and can generate financial stability risks when the risk premium on government securities increase. African banks have significant exposure to sovereign securities. These account, in many cases, for more than a quarter of the banking sector balance sheet in several countries. A third myth is that there is little that central banks can do to protect themselves and the financial sector. While the central responsibility for public debt management lies with the finance ministry, central banks can also take important actions. These include, first, to continue to strengthen monetary policy frameworks. As you all well know, this includes needing to reinforce the operational and financial independence of central banks, creating better accountability mechanisms, such as explicit interest rate target and inflation objective. Second, I think there is scope for central banks to step up communication on the role of central banks. This means tailoring it to different audiences, making it simple, expanding its reach to facilitate broader understanding of policy decisions and the trade-offs involved. A third action that needs to be considered by banks is trying to reduce the bank sovereign nexus. This includes reducing incentives for banks to hold government securities, for example, through changes to tax deductibility and exemptions, and by applying macroprudential policies. For instance, in CEMAC, the risk weights applied to member states' sovereign debt depend on their compliance with the regional convergence criteria. Finally, we also see scope to improve debt data collection to feed central bank forecasting and monitoring and modeling efforts. In particular, we think there is scope to broaden the coverage of debt statistics beyond central government to give a more complete picture of fiscal vulnerabilities. Of course, I want to be clear, and we very much understand that there is no silver bullet. All these actions cannot ensure that central banks will be fully protected against government influence. I think South Africa is a good example of a country where the central bank has come under scrutiny despite, or perhaps, of of its sound, independent institutional framework. It seems to me that in a world where central banks have more independence, they can also become more exposed to criticism and must redouble their efforts to ring-fence their policy-making role to meet financial and monetary objectives. The third myth revolves around that there is still a clear delineation of roles between monetary and fiscal policy. Before the global financial crisis, there was a consensus that monetary and fiscal policies had well-defined and separate roles. Monetary policy was, in general, responsible for smoothing out the economic cycle and ensuring price stability, while fiscal policy had to ensure public finances remained sustainable. And the objective for many emerging and low-income countries was to move towards this delineation of responsibilities, for instance, with the introduction of fiscal rules and inflation targeting frameworks that we saw spreading in the region in the first part of the 2000s. However, with the global financial crisis, the dividing line between the two policies has become more and more fuzzy. In the past decade, at least in the advanced countries, fiscal policy has gained more legitimacy and responsibility for stabilizing the economic cycle, a role traditionally assigned to monetary policy, which had lost some effectiveness. At the same time, monetary policy has increasingly resorted to unconventional measures that have some characteristics of fiscal policy. For example, the purchases of private sector assets. I think this overlap of roles and lack of clarity creates challenges, especially in our developing countries. It can foster negative spillovers across policies. I have already discussed many of these negative effects that a loose fiscal policy can have on the conduct of monetary policy. Against this background, I think that to the extent possible, the Ministry of Finance and central banks should strive to better define their respective roles and joint responsibilities in macroeconomic management. Any commingling of jobs, for instance, with central banks carrying out quasi-fiscal operations, should be avoided, except in exceptional circumstances and when monetary policy is severely constrained and the financial sector impaired. Let me finish with a final myth, that central banks can help governments alleviate the public debt burden. Some argue that central banks can help alleviate this public burden, but I don't believe this to be the case. There are, in particular, three ways that central banks can help alleviate the public burden, and I will go each one of these and note the challenges that they pose. First, should and can central banks create inflation surprise to lower debt? Research shows that inflation surprises can only reduce debt partially and temporarily until debt is rolled over at higher interest rates. And it is even less likely to work in Africa, where public debt has a relatively short maturity. Inflation is mostly driven by supply shocks, and there is a substantial share of debt in foreign currency. Second, could the central bank help improve government fiscal balance by transferring higher seniorage revenues? Estimates suggest that seniorage revenues proxied by the change in the monetary base are about 1.5% of GDP per year on average in Africa. But only part of these revenues can, of course, be transferred to the budget according to national rules. While this is not negligible, it is unlikely that central banks' profits could contribute meaningfully to the reduction of debt, where debt-to ratio in the majority of countries now exceeds 50% of GDP. Finally, some have raised the possibility that financial repression could be relied on. Debt dynamics in Africa benefit from persistently negative interest growth differential. Despite relatively high economic growth in many cases, interest rates on government debt remain relatively low, total government debt. This is partly because in many cases there is a high share of concessional debt, but in some countries financial repression has also played a role. For instance, by creating a captive audience for government securities. Could central banks do more of this? Again, this brings us back to my initial points about constraints and trade-offs for policymaking. One important constraint is that financial repression is more effective when the capital account is closed, which is not the case anymore in many of our countries. Moreover, financial repression creates distortions in the financial sector that need to be carefully considered against distortions brought by higher taxes if fiscal consolidation was used to reduce debt. It is also a matter, of course, of societal preference, since financial repression shifts the cost of debt reduction from taxpayers to bondholders. Let me end by noting that, once again, central banks are under pressure around the world. This is not a uniquely African phenomenon. So you're not alone in grappling with these challenges. But there are also ways of responding to these new challenges, and I think that rising public debt is yet another strong rationale for moving towards a more transparent, resilient, and forward-looking monetary policy framework. Thank you again for the invitation to be here. There is much for us to discuss, I believe, and I'm looking forward to the remaining sessions. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Selassie. And now, distinguished guests, it's my pleasure to invite our guest of honor, the Right Honorable Prime Minister Edouard Ngirente, to deliver his opening speech. Sir.
Honorable Ministers here present, Commissioner for Economic Affairs at the African Union Commission, Chairperson of the Association of African Central Banks, Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of UNECA, distinguished central bank governors, Director of African Department, International Monetary Fund, development partners, distinguished guests, good morning. It is my pleasure to attend this 2019 Symposium of the Association of African Central Banks, representing His Excellency Paul Kagame, the President of the Republic of Rwanda. On his behalf, I wish to welcome you all to Rwanda and thank you for being here today. I thank the Association of African Central Banks for convening this important event in Rwanda. I also commend the association for its commitment toward Africa's economic integration. Your presence here demonstrates the role of this body in bringing together African central banks to work toward a common goal. Distinguished guests, 54 years ago, the Association of African Central Banks was established to promote cooperation in the monetary, banking, and financial sphere in the African region. It was also meant to assist in the formulation of guidelines along with future agreement between African countries. Since then, African economies have gone through significant mutation despite numerous challenges. The growth path has generally been sustainable for the last 2 decades amid economic diversification and financial sector development. As the global economy continues to evolve at a higher pace, policymakers and the central banks are the key player to address new challenges to ensure that Africa continues its transformation journey in line with the Agenda 2063. Currently, with the modern financial ecosystem, we are dependent on central banks to safeguard our individual countries' monetary policy and the financial systems. They also help to set standards and protocols that make it easier to have intercontinental transaction of goods and services. In that regard, central banks are instrumental in promoting and facilitating financial deepening and inclusion as one of the drivers of investment and business expansion, modernization of payment system and reduction of transaction costs in exchange of goods and services, cross-border banking and easy exchange of currencies, and economic integration of the African continent. Therefore, despite numerous challenges like recurrent commodity prices shocks, other external shocks, and external imbalance, in some cases, African central banks have contributed to ensure macroeconomic stability. The association's role in bringing these central banks under the same umbrella to work together under a common goal should be applauded. Distinguished guests, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is aiming to create a tariff-free continent that can grow local business, boost intra-African trade, promote industrialization, and create jobs. This is one of the main solutions that can come from a united Africa collaborating to address the health of the economy and of the region. Further to this, countries and the region have signed different treaties, developed cooperation models in order to trade to each other, share knowledge, experiences, and support in solving various economic challenges. As the policymakers, we should work toward implementing our commitment and the treaties. For instance, it is common for African countries to source from far away products that can be produced by closer African countries due to a lot of transaction costs incurred from a bunch of trade regulations and tariffs that make intra-African trade inefficient. Distinguished guests, allow me to close my remarks by welcoming you all once again and wishing you productive deliberations and a very happy and pleasant stay in Rwanda. It's now my pleasure to declare the 2019 Symposium of the Association of African Central Banks officially open. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Right Honorable Prime Minister. Before I hand over the floor to the chairperson of the first plenary session, let me just mention who will be part of the session. So the theme here will be African sovereign debt management strategies, lessons from regional and international experiences. The chairperson will be Professor Florence Luoga, who's governor of the Bank of Tanzania. Speakers will be Dr. Donald Kaberuka, chairman of Southbridge and former president of the African Development Bank. Mr. Gilles Noblet, who's a principal advisor and Director General International and European Relations at ECB. And the panelists will be Mr. Temoko Meliekone, governor of the BCEAO, Mr. Leseja Kianyago, governor of the South African Reserve Bank, and Mr. Jamal Eddin Ben Belkacem, deputy governor of the Bank of Algeria. Professor Luoga, the floor is yours. Thank you. We'll also ask the speakers, who are Dr. Kaberuka, Mr. Gilles Noblet, and also the panelists, who are Mr. Temoko Melie-Kone, Mr. Leseja Kanyango, and Mr. Jamaluddin Ben Belkacem, to join them on the panel. Again, the speakers are Dr. Kaberuka and Mr. Gilles Noblet. Professor Luoga, again, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The first session will address the African sovereign debt management strategies. And we have two speakers and three panelists. I'm happy to introduce to you Dr. Donald Kaberuka, who many of you know as the former president of the African Development Bank, and Mr. Gilles Noblet, principal advisor and director general of International European Relations at the European Central Bank. We have three panelists: Mr. Temoko Melie-Kone, Governor BCAO, Mr. Leseja, the Governor South African Reserve Bank, and Mr. Mohamed Lokar, Governor of the Bank of Algeria. All these are known to us. We have 90 minutes, and I intend to ensure that we complete this session within the 90 minutes. I will allocate not more than 20 minutes to each speaker, and later on not more than 15 minutes, 30 minutes, I mean 10 minutes to each panelist. May I now invite Dr. Kaberuka, please.
Thank you, sir. Can I use the podium? Was the first. Right. Thank you. Good morning. In front of a powerful panel like this, I don't know what I want to say, because I know almost all these governors here, and they know more about debt issues than I do. So what I'll do, I'll simply raise a few issues and then let the governors argue among themselves, rather than me trying to tell them what to do. But I wanted to begin by commending the Central Bank Governors Association. I think I've watched this organization for the last decade, including during the global financial crisis, when we met in Tunis, and I think in Abidjan, I don't recall. And I think that this association has been extremely powerful in terms of fulfilling your primary mandate, monitoring financial stability, managing innovation, inclusion, and interpreting quite reasonably your independence. Now you have new challenges, technical disruption. You have issues about the new regulations post-2008. You have the global environment, and you are continuously challenged by
what does independence mean, especially my friend Lesecha there. I think that there are issues we always have to continue to innovate around. But when it comes to the issue you want me to deal with today, I thought I would do two things. A, to try to give you a context. Number two, to try to separate the chaff from what are the real issues, what are the perception issues, and what is the way forward. Because in this debate about debt in Africa, there's a lot of noise, background noise, and you cannot separate what are the issues that you will have to deal with, and what are the issues which are non-issues, and what are issues which I think are a bit of geopolitics. So this morning, this is what I want to do. And I put this picture here because it's my favorite. And I just want to look at it carefully. This is a 10-year journey almost of Africa. And see what has happened. And tell me what it tells you, what it says about the continent. It tells you that in 2002, we really had issues as a continent. You recall the war in Liberia, Sierra Leone, DRC, the disease burden, debt issues. So you had indeed the global community helping in terms of debt cancellation. So those issues were real. But I want you to fast forward from a hopeless continent to an Africa rising, to a hopeful continent, to 1 billion opportunity, now to the scramble for Africa. What does it tell you about investors? Whether they invest in debt or it is FDI. It tells you that the sentiment has shifted. And the reason investment has shifted is that investors are looking at the long term of this continent, not the short-term cycles. They are looking at the demographics. They are looking at the demographics of the world as a whole. And where they are pension fund managers, where they are institutional investors, they are taking a look at this continent. Where will it be in 50 years? Just look in 10 years, the journey we have traversed. And you quickly interpret why investors are prepared to take a look at issuances from African countries. I want you, when you go back, to reflect about this. Because we run a risk of always looking at our short-term problems and forget the long-term direction. That's the thing I wanted to say. And I want to link that up with the SDGs 2015, the famous discussion about from billions to trillions. I don't know where trillions are supposed to come from, but all of us concluded that in order to fund the SDGs, we have to go from billions to trillions. Certainly, it was not meant to come from ODA. It was not meant to come from grants. It had to come from somewhere else. And there was no conversation around these issues. And then I want you to reflect about our diversity. There's nothing like African debt problem. There are countries who have issues, there are others who have no issues. Their diversity is very important. And I want you to reflect about the lessons we have learned in terms of fiscal discipline. Because we went through a long cycle of how to manage public finances. And then finally, please be aware of the geopolitics, which we sometimes forget. So, take a look at that. So this is the narrative which has developed, that somehow Africa is drowning in debt. I mean, it has become less and less in recent weeks, but that was the story, that Africa is drowning in debt. And what have I heard? Number one, that the $99 billion which was wiped out from HIPC and MDRI will be not available in the future. That is true. That the speed of accumulation of debt is too rapid. That the thresholds have been bypassed. That there are mismatches of several types. that the composition has changed. There's the crowding out of social investments. The choice of investment is not good. There are governance issues, and then there are outdated resolution mechanisms. Now, I want to acknowledge that all these things are true. I think that we are aware of those issues, but I think that, as we all know, all nations have grown by accessing capital markets. There's nothing wrong with accessing capital markets. The issue is debt sustainability and maximizing return to development. Now, take a look at this next one. So that's the first concern I think I hear from, especially our friends the donors. So look at up to 2005, when there was this first effort at debt cancellation, and then MDRI. So that is true. The debt came down. So the issue is, so we forgave debt, and now these countries are accumulating debt again, and therefore will be required to make another effort. But I want to suggest for your discussion today, governors, that that debt problem of the past was a different type of debt. Just look at it carefully. It was a different type of debt. And no one here expects that there will be another HIPIC or MDRI. That's not the issue. I actually think that HIPIC and MDRI was supposed to make our countries attractive to the capital markets. It was not meant to take us back to depending on grants and donors. And therefore, to an extent, the HIPIC and MDRI actually has been a success. It has made us a country so attractive that investors feel they have an appetite for our issuances. So that was my next point. Now, take a look at this one. Here, I'm sure I missed my friend Abebe Selassie's presentation. I'm sure he'll have mentioned this. This is a real problem. It is not a perceived problem. Just look at the share of revenue we generate, which is now going to paying for debt. It has now gone up back to 12%, where it was almost in 1998. Now, that could mean two things. Either our revenue generating efforts are falling back, that is true in many countries, or it means that some countries are indeed accumulating debt beyond payment capacity. I think debt to GDP ratio is interesting, but this is most important. And I think, as IMF has been saying, there's an effort to be made in many of our countries in terms of generating additional revenues, not in 1 year or 2 years, but maybe over a couple of years. But this is a real issue of how much we are able to generate to pay for the debt. I hope that the governors can discuss this. It is an issue we have to address. It has several aspects. My favorite here, I used to be treasury manager a long time ago. I'm no longer. But one thing which I've learned since I left the government and I left the African Development Bank is how much money we are wasting on this thing called investment incentives. We are absolutely denying our countries revenue possibilities by giving incentives to companies who don't need it and where it is not even evident that it actually works. And when you look carefully at the numbers of many of these countries, tax holidays, all kinds of incentives, is such a huge leak that it requires political attention and it requires your attention. Because there is a free rider problem here and the prisoner's dilemma. No one country can deal with it alone. It requires collective action by all of us working together. I think if we did that, I don't know what Mr. Selassie said or will say, but I think for me, this is a soft spot. My next point is this one. So we are told that debt to GDP ratio has gone beyond redemption. So I like to call evidence. I think, Governor, you're a lawyer, Chairman. I've been told you're a very famous lawyer. So now I want to call evidence. So look at this table. So the green line and the red line are your thresholds, as defined by IMF, the red line, and MCP, the other one. There are only a few countries who have actually gone beyond the threshold. There are many countries very close to it, as you can see. But there are very few countries who have gone above. And therefore, there are two assumptions being made here. That there is some kind of linearity, that the countries will continue to accumulate debt, and that growth prospects are not good, and therefore, many of those countries below the threshold will actually go above the thresholds. It's an assumption which has been made. And as my colleague Antoinette Sayo, who used to be head of Africa Department at the IMF, said, there's a difference between raising an alarm and being an alarmist. I think this graph here raises an alarm. It is real, it is important. But it is not the same thing as being an alarmist that Africa is drowning in debt. It means that you are very close to the threshold, you have to be very careful, but each of those countries is different. And also, I want you carefully to look at the countries above the threshold. They have one thing in common. They are all dependent on oil, gas, minerals, and my take is there's an issue about management of the commodity supercycle. Not so much a debt problem, but the way they managed the commodity supercycle. So as the oil prices were going up $60, $70, $80, $100, all right, investment plans were ratcheted up, and they were not able to adjust the investment backwards because they assumed the supercycle will be forever. But many other countries, in my view, are still in green territory. What you require is management, fiscal management, investment planning. But I think this is evidence that there is a need to raise an alarm, but there is a difference between being alarmists about Africa drowning in debt. So here's my next problem. China about colonized Africa with debt. So it is true, this is from Johns Hopkins. They have a center there for Chinese studies which does wonderful work on these issues. It shows, indeed, Chinese loans has ratcheted up, but not just in Africa, it is everywhere. But also I want to suggest that 2016 was a bit of an outlier. I think the trend would be about what you see there. And that is true for all parts of the world. But if you read the press, the common press is about Africa drowning in debt because of China. But take a look at this. Many of you will not have seen this table. I've looked at countries in what we call debt distress and tried to figure out how much actually China is responsible for that. And take a look carefully at this graph. China is only responsible for 15% of the total debt. The rest of it is what you can see there. So I think here there is a bit of geopolitics which we have to try and steer clear of. There's some reality we have to interpret. But I think that you as managers of public finances, sometimes you have to step back and look at the numbers. What do they say? Now, there are some countries where this pie chart will look differently. What I've done is to aggregate all the countries in distress and figure out what is the role of China. Now, just before I conclude, because the chair said I have 20 minutes, you said? Yeah, so I'm finishing just now. Take a look at this. This is what is happening to debt worldwide, not just in Africa. You know, debt has gone up significantly since the global financial crisis for reasons which I think our colleague from the ECB will explain. So the fact that debt in Africa has ratcheted up is not unique to our continent. It is a global phenomenon which requires global management. That's what it is. I don't know if the numbers are different, but I'm sure our colleague will be telling us. And then, here is most interesting for me. The share of that global debt, which belongs to Africa. Can anybody identify what Africa is there? Take a careful look. I know I have 1 minute maybe, but take a careful look. The arrow you see on the top shows you the debt, African debt, as a share of the global debt. Almost insignificant. Almost insignificant. Globally, it might be significant nationally, but globally it is a very small share of the global debt. And I wanted to be aware of that. So let me conclude by saying that I think going forward, I see a couple of things we can look at. And these will have to be country-specific. There are no solutions for every country in the world. We have to manage the risks. We have to be careful with the choice of investments we make. Indeed, some debt funds, some investments which are not particularly very wise. There are governance issues, transparency issues. There are issues of fiscal discipline in some countries, especially those related to commodity management, domestic resource management, and public finance management. Maturities. I'm sure the governors are discussing this. Do we really have to borrow for 10 years? Can we explore, as the Ghanaians have done, longer maturities? The issues of mismatches, especially the FX, which I think you'll be discussing as well. And then I thought carefully about whether we need to think about targeting. So rather than looking at how much we have to borrow, but introduce some kind of, not inflation targeting, but debt ratios targeting in terms of how much can I afford in terms of debt service, and then you work backwards in terms of how much you should borrow. But it's something I'm still thinking about, and I've not come to conclusion. And then finally, we have to think carefully about debt management capabilities. Should we introduce independent office of debt management? I don't know. I'm simply saying that it's something we need to think about. So, finally, my favorite. As you read and hear about debt, I think remember Bloomberg. It's always important to go back to what does the data say? What does information tell us? And each time you look at the data, you'll agree with Bloomberg in some ways that actually there might be noise here, but data says something else. And I want to think about that carefully. So thank you very much, and I wish you a good deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aberuka, for your very insightful discussion. Now, let me invite
presentation. Do you know how I can load my presentation? Okay, thank you very much. First, I'm very happy to be here in this wonderful city of Kigali. I would like to thank most gracefully Governor Rwanda from the National Bank of Rwanda, Mr. Tarek Amer, Governor of Central Bank of Egypt and Chair of the AACB this year, and Mr. Papa Diop, Executive Secretary of the AACB, with whom we work regularly from the European Central Bank. The topic of debt is, of course, a key topic for us in Europe. We do not come here as good pupils. We had quite a bad story in terms of debt over the last 10 years, but hopefully our experience can bring lessons from an African perspective, either for individual countries or with the prospect of monetary union that you have in Africa, because we had to deal with debt in a monetary union, which makes the problem even more complicated. So that's why today I would like to do two things. First, to draw the lessons. Oh, doesn't seem. Oh, okay. Let's try again. Yes, to draw the lessons from what happened in Europe, and to also mention the reforms that we implemented in Europe in that respect. But the first point I would like to make, I really have difficulties with the presentation here. So, okay. The first point I would like to make is look at this historical chart. And you see several things. First, that debt episodes occur regularly. On average, every 3 to 5 years, you have big debt crises in the world. The second point is that these debt crises occurred in all the continents. We start with Africa in the 80s and 90s, but if you go to the whole span of the countries, you see that all regions of the world, also including Europe and advanced economies, have been impacted by crises. The third point, of course, I want to make is that basically debt is access to credit, and credit is key for growth and for sustainable growth. So the issue of debt is detrimental to growth and has to be assessed also in terms not only of financial stability, but in terms of growth. And that's why sound policies are key to prevent the development of excessive debt. So here again, I hope it's readable for you. Yes, I think so. If you look at the European countries, we have plotted here two things. First, the accumulation of public and private debt to GDP in European countries before the crisis. That's on the x-axis between 2008 and 2012. And on the y-axis, we have the real per capita GDP growth as of the sovereign crisis. And what you do notice is that the countries which accumulated debt before the crisis are also the countries which had the lowest rate of growth after the crisis. So I think there is a lesson that we can draw here for Europe and also probably for Africa. As was rightly pointed out, the level of debt in Africa are not so high, but the debt burden in relation to income is high, so this has an impact on growth. So this message that if you accumulate debt, you don't necessarily have high growth in the future, to the contrary, is a message which, in my view, is quite important. So then I move to my plan. I really have problems. I don't know whether I can have help for that. Maybe not. Okay. Okay, so let me first explain what is the framework we have in Europe, the macroeconomic framework in Europe. As you know, we have a single currency, we have a monetary union, which means that we have on the left side a single monetary policy for all the countries of the euro area. The objective of this monetary policy is clear: to preserve price stability with a rate below and close to 2% of inflation. Third, without prejudice to this objective, we also support the other objectives of the European community. We have a strong framework in terms of central bank independence. And finally, the central bank is not supposed to finance the government's deficit. So that's a clear framework on a monetary policy side. On the fiscal policy side, we don't have a single fiscal policies because member states are still independent and have prerogatives in that respect. So this is the competence of member states. However, in a single currency, you need to have some coordination in terms of fiscal policies. So fiscal policies are subject to common rules in terms of budgetary disciplines. And also there is a surveillance process, a regular surveillance process, how deficit and debt evolved in the different countries. And finally, we have the no bailout clause, which means that there is no debt mutualization. Country A is not supposed to assume the debt of country B. This does not prevent to have loans, and we had loans in the past, but the country is not supposed to assume permanently the debt of another country. And behind this framework, I would say that monetary policy is here to face, let's say, symmetric shocks, whether fiscal policies are there or were there in the previous framework to support asymmetric shock at the national level, which also means that countries need to build buffers in that respect. Okay. The fiscal policy leg now, we have the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe, which is an agreement between the country, a regulatory framework, which limits the level of debt and of GDP and of deficit that the countries can have. It's a rule-based framework for national policies. Unfortunately, this framework was facing a lot of shortcomings. First, there was too much discretion, political discretion in implementing the rules, or not only by the country in charge of fiscal policies, but also countries in charge of surveying these policies. And there was also too little automaticity. There was provision in this framework saying if you reach a certain level of debt, there are certain procedures which apply, certain sanctions can be applied, but at the end, these procedures were not automatic, which means that there were a lot of leeway between the moment when there is a problem and the moment when we try to tackle the problem. This was also by the weaknesses in the decision-making process. So within the Council of Ministries of Finance, there was always a sort of reluctance by country A to sanction country B, because country A was fearing that next time it would be the culprit and subject to sanctions. So there has been a sort of understanding between countries not to criticize each other and not to sanction each other. And based on that, of course, then there was little ownership at the national level to take into account the European dimension of fiscal policies. So the design of the fiscal policy was not optimal, and the implementation of fiscal policy was not optimal either. Okay, so here again, if you look at the right part of this slide, the chart on the right, we have plotted two things, the fiscal stance and the output gap. So what is the evolution of the fiscal stance compared to the output gap? And here, if you look on the bottom right with the green triangles, you see that during the period of high growth before the crisis, 2004-2008, countries ran pro-cyclical easing fiscal policies, which of course led to the problem that during the crisis, and I move now to the bottom, to the top left of this chart, which are the red dots, countries had to implement pro-cyclical tightening during the recession, which was of course absolutely suboptimal. And now, and I move to the blue squares, you see that all in all we have a relatively neutral fiscal stance in Europe with some differences, maybe slightly positive fiscal stance all in all, and this is all reflected in the left part of this slide. So in terms of situation of debt, where do we stand? So we had an increase in public and private debt in Europe during the crisis for, let's say, three main factors. First of all, there was a positive gap between the interest rates on one side and nominal growth, so there was a first problem for debt. The second issue was that primary balances deteriorated sharply in many countries. And the third aspect is that we had deficit debt adjustment measures. What does it mean? Is that during the financial crisis, governments had to support the financial sector to a large extent, and it has really contributed to the large increase in public debt. At the same time, if you look at the left part of this slide, you see that the level of debt in the euro area is relatively low or moderate compared to other regions, especially Japan, for example. But of course, and this is the right part, these heights different in countries, differences in countries. So this is an issue, especially in a monetary union, when you have to manage a single monetary policy. So these differences in debt in the various countries create challenges for monetary policy and for financial stability. So turning to monetary policy, we actually had to implement a series of measures. Here you have the official interest rate of the ECB, so we operate through a corridor of interest rates, and you see how we had to cut sharply the interest rate in 2008 and 2009, and now we are at a level, that's the right part of the chart, very close to zero, even having some of our official rates even being in negative territory. So we have really cut interest rates very sharply. Nevertheless, despite that, markets started differentiating between those countries with fiscal sustainability concerns. And here you see the spreads of countries compared to Germany, and you see the sharp hike in interest rate in some countries, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain, in 2011, 2012. Since then, of course, we have come back to much more reasonable spreads, but you see how fiscal lack of discipline can have a sharp impact on financial market and on interest rate spread. And of course, this has also an impact on financial fragmentation. So basically, because you had big spreads in, let's say, sovereign debt, this had also an impact on private debt and on credit. And you can see how these spreads in sovereign debt impacted the cost of borrowing for companies on the left. So if you see in the years 2012, 13, you had this sharp difference between countries, which of course was reduced then thanks to the monetary policy measures on which I will come, and thanks also to the fiscal discipline that was finally exerted by most of the country. On the right part, you have the same phenomenon for household purchases, for house purchases, so the widening of the spreads, and finally the contraction of these spreads, and also the overall decline in the level of rates in most of these countries. This also caused negative growth, so we had a negative growth rate of credit not only for companies on the left. Look, for example, at Spain, how negative the rate of growth of credit to companies was, and also on the right part of the slide for households. Of course, we have recovered now, but you had this sharp impact. So again, how public debt can impact private debt and private credit to the private sector. Inflation was also very, very low. We even had a negative inflation rate in the years 2015 and 16, which was, of course, a big, big challenge for the European Central Bank. So if we exclude, of course, energy and food, inflation was above the zero bound, but if we have the overall HACP, we had negative inflation rates for at least 2 years. So what kind of measures did the ECB take? They took a series of measures, and I would say we had several objectives for that. First, to preserve price stability, and price stability has to be preserved upwards and downwards. So in our case, the idea was to preserve prices to go at a too low level and to run at a too low rate of growth. So we had really this challenge of preserving price stability in both directions. We had the objective of reduce financial fragmentation that I described before. We also had to avoid what we call the risk of redomination, meaning markets challenging the membership of some countries in the euro area, and this was a big challenge that we had to tackle. And we had also to ensure the smooth transmission mechanism of monetary policy all over the euro area. So we took a series of measures. The first measure was to provide liquidity at fixed rate full allotment, so any bank coming could have full liquidity provision at fixed rate. We had also long-term refinancing operation targeted to some specific sector of the economy. We had the asset purchase program, so we bought government securities but also private securities. We had ultra-monetary transaction measures, meaning for countries in difficulties where the interest rates are so high that it impacts the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, we can run a special operation based on strong conditionality imposed on the country. We developed forward guidance like many central banks, so let's say guiding expectation in terms of interest rate over a certain number of years, and we also expanded the collateral that we accept in our monetary policy operation. The main lesson that we can draw then in terms of fiscal soundness is that in a monetary union you need some fiscal policies. You need to build buffers in good times so that can be used in bad times. You need to avoid pro-cyclical fiscal policies, and I think the chart I show you was quite important in that respect. Avoid also this constant deficit bias in countries, because then you accumulate debt in the long term. Also take into account the spillovers that fiscal policy in one country can have in another country in terms of, in a monetary union. That's quite important. And let the fiscal automatic stabilizer play their role, provided you have developed fiscal buffers. So fiscal policies are also important for monetary policy. Why? Because fiscal policy tends to have a direct impact on price stability through increasing VAT, for example. It has an indirect impact on inflation through public wages or aggregate demand. And also unsustainable fiscal policies pose different risks to monetary policy in terms of increasing pressure on a central bank to tolerate higher inflation. That's the topic of fiscal dominance. Also, the fiscal stress creates dysfunctional government bond markets, and we intervene on government bond markets, so this has an impact on monetary policy. And also, it has an impact on the balance sheet of banks, and then an impact on financial stability, which is part of the remit of the central bank. So now, if I move from the lessons to the reforms that we implemented. So there are several provisions in the treaty. I will not impose upon you this provision. It's quite complicated, but we have several provisions in terms of level of deficit, 3% maximum, level of debt, 60% maximum, and then a series of provisions in terms of coordination of economic policies, financial assistance to countries in exceptional circumstances, the no monetary financing by the ECB, which I already mentioned, no privileged access by government to financial institution lending, and the no bailout clause, which I also mentioned. The SGP, so the Stability and Growth Pact, has been reformed constantly, I would say with different directions. First, have nominal anchors in terms of monetary policy, in terms of fiscal policy. Second, develop buffers in countries that can be used in bad times. Third, avoid pro-cyclicality. And fourth, to promote coordination of fiscal policies to the largest extent possible. So we had a series of reforms. For the sake of time, I will not detail this reform, but we had the six-pack reform, creating expenditure benchmark and debt rule. The fiscal compact, we also ask countries in their own national provision, possibly in the constitution, to have debt rule or balanced budget rules. We had the two-pack reform, which consisted in reinforcing the coordination of budgetary policies among countries and reinforcing the surveillance of these policies. We have also new methodology to better ensure the correction of excessive deficit toward the norms, but also flexibility. We have to find the right balance between rules on one side and discretion on the other side. And this is a difficult balancing act that you may be faced with. So rules are important, but in some part you have to implement the rules with a sufficient degree of flexibility to ensure their good implementation. So we have, as I said, two different arms in the SGP. The preventing arms, so prevent countries from running a large deficit, and the corrective arms, how countries must reduce their deficit and debt when they are in trouble. Again, I will not detail here, but there is a series of provision, steps, and a long procedure in order to prevent and correct the deficit. The result of that is that we had a quite sizable consolidation of fiscal policies in Europe. So this is based on the structural balance. And you see that in most of the countries, there has been a strong consolidation, meaning that some countries have even leeway now to implement expansionary fiscal policies. We at the ECB are quite prudent in that respect, but we see some fiscal space in some countries that can be used at the moment to support economic growth. Here, another way to measure that is to see to what extent the countries are far away from the medium-term objective they have in terms of fiscal consolidation. And you can see on the left that some countries are even a positive distance, so they have been even better pupil than we asked, so they have a good fiscal position that can be used for expansionary fiscal policies. We are on the right, of course, you have the countries which are still lagging behind the objectives in terms of expenditures, deficit and debt, and for which still efforts need to be made, all the more since, as you see with these blue dots on the right part of the chart, all the more since the countries have a high level of debt to GDP ratio. So here you have this kind of heat map when you see with very little green area, meaning that many countries, as regard the preventing arm, so preventing deficit to develop, many countries are still far behind the objective they should reach, and there are very few countries, these are the green areas, which have implemented the requirement. It's better in terms of a correction arm, so once you are in trouble, you have to implement measures, and here more countries have implemented the measures aiming at correcting the fiscal imbalances. So looking ahead, in terms of monetary union, the current paradigm or the past paradigm that we have was a single monetary policy in charge of dealing with symmetric shock. This is the right part of the chart. And fiscal policies at the national level in charge of dealing with asymmetric shock. Looking ahead and how to improve this framework. So in the previous slide, you saw the top part of this slide. And the problem with this paradigm that we have is that dealing with national asymmetric shock by national policies is possible if we have fiscal space, but countries run out of fiscal space. And on the right-hand part, monetary policy to deal with symmetric shock is possible as long as you have not reached the zero lower bound, which we did reach in many aspects. So then you need something else. You need a certain central stabilization function for fiscal policy. So how do we implement that? Is it for dealing with symmetric shock? For asymmetric shock? That can be both. There is a debate at the moment. Which kind of stabilization do you have? Is it an unemployment insurance? Is it a rainy day fund? Is it an investment facility? So we are all this sort of discussion at the European level at the moment. We will see how we go. But I think really the call now is not only to have fiscal discipline, but also how you can develop in a monetary union a fiscal stabilization function. So conclusion now, as I already mentioned in the past, fiscal policy do matter for monetary policy and for financial stability. Designing fiscal rule is key in terms of debt, deficit, and it's key in a monetary union even more so than in a single country. You need to build fiscal buffer in good times. You need to avoid cross-cyclicality to the most extent possible. And also, again, in the union, spillovers are important, and internalizing the spillovers of country A and country B is something that should be in the radar screen of government. So I thank you here, and I hope this presentation on Europe would be helpful, again, not only for individual countries in Africa, but also in light of the prospect of monetary union in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's put our hands together again for our distinguished speakers. Yes, after hearing from the two speakers, Dr. Kaperuka tells us, hey, let's be cautious here. Let's safeguard against alarmism. We need to have the narrative correct before we go over the hinge. And Mr. Noblet has very ably shared with us the European experiences. But let's hear from our panelists today before we have chance to contribute to the subject. I will start with the Honorable Governor, Governor Kone, and I will give you the flexibility of making your presentation while seated. Please, Governor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais pouvoir faire ma présentation en français et peut-être permettre aux uns et aux autres de porter leur casque et puis vous permettre aussi d'aller sur le pupitre, ce qui me permettrait d'être un peu plus à l'aise et surtout de permettre une traduction qui soit à la hauteur de la présentation. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Excellences, Monsieur le gouverneur et honorables invités, prenant la parole pour la première fois, je voudrais remercier le gouverneur de la Banque centrale, la Banque nationale du Rwanda, pour son chaleureux accueil et pour la qualité des facilités mises à la disposition de nos délégations. Permettez-moi aussi de saluer la pertinence du thème choisi pour cette édition 2019 du symposium annuel de notre association qui met en lumière des défis importants auxquels les États africains sont confrontés dans le contexte actuel marqué par des besoins énormes de ressources pour le financement des projets de développement, notamment en termes d'infrastructures socio-économiques. Il m'a été demandé de partager avec vous l'expérience des pays, des États membres de l'Union économique et monétaire ouest-africaine en matière de gestion de la dette publique. C'est pour cela que je voudrais commencer par remercier mon prédécesseur qui a présenté de façon très claire les contraintes qui s'imposent à toute union monétaire, notamment le pacte de stabilité et de croissance, qui est aussi le nôtre à quelques variantes près. Alors, je voudrais évoquer le contexte et les enjeux de la création d'un marché régional de la dette souveraine dans les pays de l'UMOA et les initiatives prises pour accroître son efficacité, l'objectif étant de parvenir à un endettement équilibré des États. Bien sûr, je tirerai quelques leçons de cette présentation. Mesdames et Messieurs, depuis sa création en 1962 jusqu'à la fin des années 90, les statuts de la BCEAO lui permettaient de faire des avances monétaires directes aux États membres de l'UMOA, à l'instar de la plupart des pays, des banques centrales des pays d'Afrique. Ces concours devaient en principe être remboursés durant l'année budgétaire. Ils étaient plafonnés pour chaque pays à 20% des recettes fiscales de l'avant-dernier exercice budgétaire. À la suite des chocs macroéconomiques que les pays ont connus dans les années 80 et 90, les États membres de l'UMOA ont eu des difficultés pour rembourser les concours monétaires octroyés par la BCEAO. L'encours de ces concours représentait environ 1,3 milliard de dollars des États-Unis et représentait plus de 33% des recettes fiscales de cette année pour une norme fixée à 20%. Conscient des conséquences de cette situation sur le bilan de la Banque centrale et sur la stabilité macroéconomique des pays de façon générale, le Conseil des ministres de l'UMOA a décidé de l'abandon à l'horizon 2001 des concours monétaires directs de la Banque centrale et de l'adoption de modalités plus modernes et plus souples de couverture des besoins de financement des États. Cette décision intervenait dans un contexte aussi de libéralisation et de modernisation des instruments de politique monétaire prônés à l'époque par le Fonds monétaire international. La création du marché régional de la dette publique comportait 3 enjeux majeurs, à savoir moderniser la gestion de la dette publique, permettre à la politique monétaire de disposer de la flexibilité nécessaire à une grande efficacité dans l'utilisation des instruments de régulation et offrir aussi aux investisseurs, aux épargnants et aux investisseurs institutionnels de l'Union des supports de placement diversifiés. Au terme des actions entreprises par la BCEAO, le marché de la dette publique dans le mois a vu le jour en 2001 et l'encours des titres publics a progressivement augmenté sur ce marché pour se situer à environ 4 milliards de dollars, soit 5,6% du PIB ou 35,2% des recettes fiscales. En 2011, nous avons décidé de donner une nouvelle impulsion au marché régional de la dette publique dans l'UEMOA. À cette époque, les pays de l'Union, après avoir mené des réformes d'assainissement de leur cadre macroéconomique et surtout bénéficié des initiatives internationales de réduction de la dette, ces États se sont engagés dans d'ambitieux programmes de développement visant une croissance forte, durable et inclusive. Ces programmes étaient basés sur des investissements massifs dans les infrastructures, dont la réalisation nécessite d'importantes ressources financières. Afin de permettre au marché régional de la dette publique de couvrir une partie de ses besoins de financement, des études diagnostiques ont été menées pour détecter les obstacles au bon fonctionnement du marché et identifier les principales actions permettant de le dynamiser. La principale mesure prise dans ce cadre a été la création en 2013 de l'agence UMOA Titres, qui est une agence communautaire chargée d'assister les États membres dans la mobilisation des ressources de manière coordonnée et cohérente sur les marchés de capitaux. À ce titre, l'agence conseille les trésors nationaux dans l'élaboration de leur stratégie d'émission des titres, coordonne leurs programmes d'émission, mène des actions de renforcement des capacités des trésors, gère les émissions par adjudication et diffuse également l'information économique financière auprès des investisseurs, ce qui est un élément important de participation à ce marché. L'agence a, en collaboration avec le Fonds monétaire international, élaboré un guide de bonnes pratiques en matière d'émission de titres publics dans l'Union, qui définit les principales orientations relatives aux interventions des États sur les marchés financiers régionaux et internationaux. Ce guide se veut un document de référence pour les émetteurs et retrace les meilleures pratiques à observer de la préparation des opérations d'émission à leur dénouement, de même que la gestion de la relation émetteur-investisseur. L'agence a également mené des démarches pour le référencement des titres publics sur les plateformes informationnelles que sont Reuters et Bloomberg, donnant ainsi une visibilité internationale au marché financier régional. De façon opérationnelle, l'agence joue le rôle de front office avec l'organisation matérielle des émissions, notamment la préparation des appels d'offres, le lancement de l'adjudication, le dépouillement et la publication des résultats. La Banque centrale, de son côté, intervient dans les activités de back-office. À ce titre, elle débite et crédite les comptes de l'État qui se trouvent dans ce livre et assure le règlement des transactions. Mesdames et Messieurs, en plus des réformes menées par l'agence UMOA Titres, la BCEAO a également pris un ensemble de mesures pour renforcer la liquidité des titres publics et plus généralement pour approfondir le marché secondaire des titres. Ainsi, elle a décidé en 2014 d'accepter comme collatéral à ses guichets de refinancement les obligations souveraines émises sur le marché régional de la dette publique, en plus des bons de trésor qui étaient déjà admissibles d'office. Par ailleurs, un guichet spécial dédié au refinancement des titres de longue maturité a été mis en place au niveau du marché. La BCEAO a également mené des actions pour la création d'un fonds de stabilité financière dans l'UMOA, qui a pour vocation d'apporter une assistance rapide aux États confrontés à des difficultés de remboursement de leurs échéances sur le marché financier régional. L'existence d'un tel fonds vise à atténuer la perception du risque intrinsèque des pays ainsi que celle du risque systémique et donc à crédibiliser davantage le marché de la dette publique. De même, des actions ont été menées en vue d'implémenter le mécanisme de pension livré sur le marché, de développer et sécuriser les échanges de titres publics. En plus, un corps de spécialistes en valeur du trésor a été créé en 2013 afin de contribuer à la liquidité des titres sur le marché secondaire. Toutes ces actions ont considérablement amélioré l'environnement des émissions des titres publics sur le marché. Le montant des ressources levées s'est accru de manière significative et, à titre illustratif, l'encours des ressources mobilisées annuellement sur le marché de la dette publique est passé de 2 601 milliards en 2011, soit 5,1 milliards de dollars, à 9 991 milliards de francs CFA, c'est-à-dire environ 17 milliards de dollars US. En pourcentage du PIB, il est ressorti à 14% en 2018 contre 7% en 2011, soit un doublement en 7 ans. De même, la structure des émissions n'a cessé de se modifier en faveur des titres à long terme. En effet, la part des obligations dans l'encours global des titres publics est passée de 63,3% en 2011 à 89% en 2018. Le dernier élément que je voudrais ajouter à ce cadre de gestion de la dette publique, c'est un cadre de bonnes pratiques pour les contrats de partenariat public-privé. Ce genre de partenariat constitue aujourd'hui un volet important de l'endettement public pour le financement des infrastructures. Ce cadre est en cours de finalisation et devrait permettre aux États d'avoir de meilleurs comportements dans ce genre d'activités et notamment pour tirer le meilleur parti de ce genre de partenariat qui aujourd'hui est de plus en plus utilisé. Quels sont les enseignements que nous avons tirés de l'existence de ce marché? La première leçon, c'est que le développement du marché de la dette publique offre de réelles opportunités de mobilisation des ressources pour les États. Toutefois, cela ne doit pas les amener à perdre de vue la nécessité de contenir le déficit public et surtout, comme il a été dit par mes prédécesseurs, les efforts pour mobiliser d'autres types de ressources que l'endettement sur les marchés. Le deuxième enseignement que nous avons tiré a trait à la nécessité pour les États de renforcer justement la mobilisation des ressources internes en vue d'assurer la viabilité de la politique budgétaire. Les réformes sont nécessaires pour améliorer significativement la collecte des recettes fiscales et non fiscales et d'éviter de recourir systématiquement à l'endettement pour le financement de leurs projets de développement. La troisième leçon est la nécessité de renforcer la qualité et l'efficacité des investissements publics afin d'améliorer le potentiel de croissance à long terme et créer ainsi les conditions d'un remboursement harmonieux de la dette. Il s'agira pour les États d'orienter des dépenses en capital vers les secteurs porteurs de croissance, d'améliorer la transparence dans l'attribution et l'exécution des contrats de réalisation des infrastructures publiques et de mettre en place un dispositif de suivi et évaluation des investissements publics. Ce sont là, et pour tenir compte du délai qui nous est imparti, c'est les quelques points saillants, les éléments que j'ai souhaité partager avec vous sur notre expérience en matière de gestion de la dette publique qui implique la Banque centrale et la gestion cohérente de la politique monétaire. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Governor Konen. May I take the opportunity now to call upon Governor Lesego?
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me cause trouble. Because you see, if you put any group of central bankers together, they have nothing positive to say about treasuries. And I have heard it this morning. And in a way, I had a sense that this session should have swapped with the session that comes after it. But I think that what the speakers have done is that they have gotten into that section anyway in defining the problem, because we started by defining the strategy and the lessons before we got into the nature of the problem. But I think that our two lead speakers have done a very good job. So let's accept that the debt dynamics have changed. And as you had seen from the slides, there is an increasing use of market-based debt. And this market-based debt has also reflecting two important dynamics. One is that countries have been able to access international capital markets, and secondly is that other countries have also been able to develop domestic capital markets. And the development of domestic capital markets becomes very important because it helps countries avoid the original sin. But with looser monetary policies in the developed world, the development of domestic capital market also then began to attract money from offshore. So the foreign debt is no longer just purely a foreign currency denominated debt. It's also partly a domestic currency denominated debt, as foreigners have become very active in domestic capital markets. Which then says that should any country then, which this kind of exposures face debt distress situation, it becomes a challenge to resolve. You can't go to the Paris Club to deal with these things. You're going to deal with lots of investors from different jurisdictions, and that becomes a challenge. And so, as we think of the alarm that is being raised, without being alarmist, the alarm that is being raised says to us, we have also got to think about if a country falls into debt distress with this changed nature of the debt dynamics, how do you resolve such a debt situation? It calls for different sets of skills in treasuries. And one of the things that comes is that treasuries have got to borrow smart. Well, for you to borrow smart, you must be smart in the first place. And that means that treasuries have got to be skilled differently to be able to negotiate with the private sector creditors. But this session is supposed to deal with the debt strategies, and the debt strategies, if one has to think about the debt strategies, one has got to think of this thing from a policy perspective. And so the first point I want to make from a policy perspective is that debt is an outcome of what the deficit was. And the deficit itself is a function of revenue and expenditure. And there is this narrative that I worry about that says that the reason why we have the problem is just that we are not generating enough revenue. And we are not asking the question, are we getting into debt problems because we are not managing our expenditure effectively? And because we are not managing our expenditures effectively, we end up with deficits that might be unsustainable, that themselves generate amounts of debt that we are unable to carry through. So we have got to think of the debt situation as part of sound macroeconomic management policies. So my first point that I'm making with this respect is that credible, sound fiscal policies are at the heart of what you will end up having to manage as a debt manager. The second point that I want to make is the coordination that has to take place between debt managers and monetary policy makers, the central bank in this respect. And so Donald raised an important point. Should debt management offices be independent? The jury is still out. I am not sure that they should be. But reckless debt management strategies could actually complicate the life of monetary policy making, because the decisions and the posture that debt managers take in their own issuance conduct give signals to the market about the conduct of fiscal policy. And so, when monetary policy has to formulate its stance, the fiscal policy might tell you that, oh, we are pursuing counter-cyclical policy, we are being tight on fiscal. That don't look there. Look at what the debt managers do. As soon as you see the debt managers ramping up their issuance, you must know that fiscal policy is in trouble. That is why there is more debt being issued, and it's got to be watched. It's got to be watched quite closely. And so the coordination then, and I must be careful here, when I talk of coordination between public debt management and monetary coordination, I am not talking of debt managers telling central banks what to do. I am talking about understanding and appreciating the impact of the conduct of each other's policies on the other. Because as I had said, debt management strategies could have impact on monetary conditions. Third point that I want to make has to do with this thing that fiscal policy have got to be balancing the issues of growth and debt sustainability. As if any country can just borrow itself out of poverty and borrow itself towards growth. The evidence seems to be suggesting that countries that contain their debt and become sustainable from a debt perspective tend to actually be growing better than those who think they can borrow their way out of trouble. Now, I'm a central banker, so central banking is straightforward. There is a monetary policy anchor. You get given a mandate of price stability. You've given the independence, you pursue it. But fiscal policy, which is what drives that dynamics, is complex. And there's been talk of having, coming up with fiscal rules and what the fiscal rules will actually mean, and they might make the role of monetary policy easier, especially if the fiscal rules are are implemented adequately. But in thinking about the role of fiscal policy and in balancing with growth, I would like to propose three guidelines which I think would become important. The first one, which had been alluded by Gillis, has to do with the counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy. And I'm sure if you took that graph and you looked at what many African countries had done, especially commodity exporters, we had actually been pro-cyclical. When the commodity cycle, super cycle was on, we were also ramping up borrowing, we were ramping up fiscal deficits, and when we were faced with attempts of trade shock, instead of making adjustments on fiscal policy, we thought, actually we did this. We knelt down in prayer and hoped that the prices will rise again instead of making adjustments to live within what we are faced with. And so counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy becomes important. The second is that we have got, in taking our fiscal stance, be cognizant of our posture with respect to debt sustainability, understanding that we can't have debt just continuing to grow and debt service costs continuing to grow ad infinitum. There has got to be a limit. And in a way, an attempt by the AMCP program in putting debt limits and deficit limits was actually taking cognizance of that. And I get worried when a narrative now begins to come that says, let us revise these things higher so that we can create fiscal space. That's not how fiscal space gets created. You can't create fiscal space by allowing debt to rise unsustainably. The third guideline or principle that I would like to offer is that of intergenerational equity. Because you see, we can't allow the excesses of today's generations to put pressure on future generations. We think that we could just spend and borrow and leave the debt burden with our children and our children's children, without asking the hard questions of, what is this debt for? If the debt is incurred to generate or create assets for the future of the nation, or to invest in the prosperity of a nation, then we are creating intergenerational equity. But if we are just going to spend because we are scared of having difficult conversation with the public service, and that we would like to get them to continue to be earning salary increases that are not sustainable relative to the budgets, then we are not doing any justice to the generations that come. And let me conclude my point about what this debt is used for and the importance of transparency. We have got to be transparent about what we are borrowing for. And we actually need to be presenting to our citizens the implications of the debt acquisition that we are making, and we need to be sharing with them our own take about the sustainability or otherwise of that debt. That transparency for me is very important. The second element of the transparency, things happen. I have heard of people hiding assets in some faraway countries, and then we will call them illicit flows, and we will try and find them. But goodness me, I can't believe for the sake of it how people hide debt. Because at some stage somebody is going to come to you and say, you owe me. But that is exactly what is happening. The lack of transparency in some of these debt acquisitions, that we accumulate debt, we hide it from our citizens, and at some stage it rears its head and then it comes to bite us. So this transparency is important not just from the debt managers and from the fiscal authorities, but from the side of the private sector, who themselves create debt that is opaque in nature. And so let me pause it there and hope that I would have generated enough heat for conversations to take place.
Thank you, Governor. May I now invite Governor Luka from Algeria?
Voilà, c'est bon. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais, à travers un peu l'expérience de mon pays en matière d'endettement, partager avec vous un peu cette expérience, et selon deux aspects. Le premier, c'est que peut-être qu'en matière d'endettement, l'Algérie représente réellement ce qu'aucun pays ne doit faire. Ce qu'il ne faut pas faire en matière d'endettement. La deuxième chose, c'est que, pour être en phase avec les collègues qui sont passés, il n'y a pas seulement un problème de dette. Le problème de la dette provient souvent et tout le temps, en fait, des problèmes de politique inappropriée en matière de recettes fiscales et en matière de dépenses. Voilà. Donc, alors, nous avons eu en gros 3 périodes en matière de dette en Algérie. La première période, c'est 86-94. Au cours des années 90, l'Algérie a connu une grave crise résultant d'une gestion, j'allais dire, calamiteuse pratiquement de son endettement. Avant le choc pétrolier de 86, l'Algérie accusait déjà des déficits budgétaires qui provenaient de son modèle de développement et qui étaient en fait des prêts nets du Trésor au développement des entreprises publiques pour financer leurs investissements. C'était déjà des déficits assez importants. Et ces investissements-là étaient financés par endettement, notamment externe, de sorte que la dette extérieure, avant le choc de 1986, était déjà de 30% du PIB. Évidemment, le choc pétrolier a fait baisser les recettes recettes budgétaires. Il faut savoir que dans mon pays, les recettes, la fiscalité sur le pétrole et le gaz représente à peu près, à l'époque, elle représentait autour de 50% des recettes totales. Donc si vous avez la moitié de vos recettes fiscales d'hydrocarbures qui baissent de 50%, forcément, vos recettes totales vont baisser énormément. Et donc le déficit budgétaire, on est arrivé jusqu'à 14% du PIB. Et c'est là qu'il y a des politiques inappropriées. Vous avez des déficits budgétaires et il faut faire des ajustements. Il faut faire des ajustements budgétaires. Parce que ces déficits budgétaires, évidemment, entraînaient des déficits de balance des paiements aussi. Donc il faut faire des ajustements. Et ces ajustements n'ont pas été faits. On ne l'a pas fait. Et donc là, il y a eu persistance de ces déséquilibres budgétaires qui ont évidemment, la conséquence, c'est une augmentation de la dette extérieure qui était montée à 52% du PIB en 1993. Vous allez me dire que ce n'est pas beaucoup, puisque l'Europe, c'est 60% du PIB, mais en fait, c'est la composition de la dette. Là, c'est la mauvaise gestion de la dette. Politique inappropriée en matière de recettes et de dépenses publiques, mais ensuite, quand il y a eu endettement, il y a eu mauvaise gestion de la dette, puisque, en fait, c'était une dette à court terme. C'était pratiquement des crédits fournisseurs, et c'est sa composition qui posait problème. Elle était à court terme, en fait, c'était pour la consommation, c'était même pas pour l'investissement. Et donc, en 1993, le service de la dette représentait 90% des exportations de biens et services. Et donc elle devenait totalement insoutenable. Donc il y a deux erreurs majeures de politique économique qui ont entraîné un endettement qui est devenu ensuite insoutenable. Donc un endettement excessif à court terme, donc en l'absence de politique d'ajustement des comptes extérieurs et budgétaires. Et ensuite l'absence d'anticipation. Quand on a des déséquilibres qui durent, qui sont pérennes sur 2, 3, 4, 5 ans, parce que les prix du pétrole se sont maintenus à un niveau relativement bas, quand on a ce genre de déséquilibre-là, forcément, et qu'on n'a pas de réserve de change, forcément, à un moment donné, l'ajustement doit se faire et de manière brutale. Et donc, une dépréciation du taux de change. On n'a pas anticipé cela. Les autorités de l'époque, en tout cas, n'ont pas anticipé cela. Et quand, évidemment, le service de la dette devenait insoutenable, évidemment, on a demandé le rééchelonnement de la dette, et le rééchelonnement de la dette a entraîné, évidemment, le plan d'ajustement structurel avec le FMI. Et évidemment, là, le FMI, tout de suite, c'est 40% de dévaluation. 40% de dévaluation, et donc ça a augmenté encore plus le poids de la dette extérieure exprimée en monnaie nationale. Alors, ensuite, les années... Bon, il y a eu le plan d'ajustement structurel, donc notre économie a été ajustée, un peu libéralisée. Le problème de la dette, donc, il a été rééchelonné, donc ça ne posait plus de problème. Les années 2000 à 2014, le recours au plan d'ajustement structurel du FMI a été, j'allais dire, un traumatisme pour nos autorités, pour nos gouvernants. Dans ce sens où ils l'ont vécu comme une perte de souveraineté. Et donc, au lieu d'incriminer la gestion de la dette, la mauvaise gestion de la dette, ou les mauvaises politiques budgétaires qui étaient menées, on a incriminé l'instrument lui-même. C'est-à-dire, c'est la dette. La dette, c'est devenu un tabou, c'est devenu le diable. Il ne fallait pas s'endetter. Et donc, à la faveur de l'augmentation des prix du pétrole à partir des années 2000, qui ont eu évidemment pendant 14 ans, de 2000 à 2014, on a eu des excédents budgétaires énormes, on a eu des excédents de balance des paiements énormes, ça a permis de constituer une épargne nette de l'État, je dis bien nette, une épargne nette de l'État d'environ 70 milliards de dollars à fin 2013, ça a permis de constituer autour de 194 milliards de dollars de réserves de change, toujours à fin 2013. Et donc, avec cette aisance financière, les autorités ont décidé de rembourser par anticipation la dette extérieure, qui était à peu près de 26 milliards de dollars. De sorte que maintenant, on est peut-être le pays le moins endetté du monde de dette extérieure. Hein. C'est 1% et demi du PIB, pas plus. Et puis les autorités ont pris la décision, évidemment, en 2009, de suspendre tout financement extérieur, y compris pour les investissements dans le secteur public marchand et privé. En faisant cela, on se prive très très souvent, quand on fait des prêts quand on fait des prêts auprès d'institutions financières internationales, telles que la Banque mondiale ou la Banque africaine de développement, non seulement il y a des financements, mais il y a surtout l'expertise qui vient derrière, qui vient avec. C'est ça qui est le plus intéressant. À titre d'exemple, en 2006, la Banque centrale, Banque d'Algérie, a décidé de moderniser ses systèmes de paiement. On n'avait pas besoin de financement de la Banque mondiale, pas du tout. Mais bon, on s'est dit, autant être accompagné par la Banque mondiale, être suivi par la Banque mondiale dans la gestion du projet. On a fait un prêt de 40 millions de dollars, mais on n'en avait pas réellement besoin. Mais on l'a fait uniquement pour avoir cette assistance et d'être suivi par la Banque mondiale. Donc on s'est privé, en renonçant à tout financement extérieur, surtout de la part des institutions financières internationales, on s'est privé évidemment de cette expertise. Alors, dans les années 2000, dans le même temps évidemment où le prix du pétrole augmentait, où les recettes fiscales augmentaient, on a fait une politique d'expansion budgétaire absolument énorme. À la fois une explosion du budget d'équipement, et en même temps aussi une explosion du budget de fonctionnement. De sorte qu'en 2014, même à 100 dollars le baril, on avait un déficit budgétaire de 7% du PIB. 7% du PIB avec un baril à 100 $. Quand on prend le ratio dépenses publiques sur dépenses intérieures brutes, sur absorption, il avoisine pratiquement celui des pays scandinaves, ou de la France, ou de l'Allemagne. Mais eux, c'est quand même fondé sur une fiscalité, sur l'économie réelle, alors que nous, c'était sur une fiscalité volatile qui était les hydrocarbures. Évidemment, donc, ensuite, la chute brutale du prix du pétrole en juin 2014 a eu pour conséquence, évidemment, des déficits budgétaires énormes, colossaux, 15% du PIB, de sorte que l'épargne nette de l'État, qui était de 70 milliards de dollars, a fondu pratiquement en 2 ans et demi. Ça y est, maintenant, il n'y a plus d'épargne nette de l'État. Et des déficits énormes aussi de balance des paiements, qui ont fait fondre les réserves de change de 194 milliards en 2013 à pratiquement 70 milliards à fin 2018. Donc des 2/3 pratiquement. Alors, cette politique-là, bon, pas d'endettement, et on a refusé ensuite de faire de l'ajustement, ni des comptes extérieurs, ni de l'ajustement budgétaire. Et alors, l'aberration un petit peu en matière de politique d'endettement maintenant, c'est que faute de cette politique d'ajustement, donc pas d'endettement extérieur qui était un tabou, et faute aussi de réformes structurelles qui permettraient de revoir un peu le modèle de croissance qui était tiré par la dépense publique dans les années 2000, eh bien, on a eu recours à un changement de la loi, parce que la loi bancaire en Algérie interdisait les financements monétaires, carrément interdisait les financements monétaires des déficits publics. Eh bien, on est revenu sur cette loi, on l'a fait passer au Parlement, on a refait cette loi, et on a, par euphémisme, on a appelé ça financement non conventionnel, mais en fait, c'est un financement monétaire direct de la Banque centrale. Voilà. Voilà où on en est en ce moment dans mon pays en matière de gestion de la dette. Donc en conclusion, donc très souvent dans nos pays en Afrique, c'est les politiques budgétaires inappropriées en fait qui entraînent des dettes excessives et insoutenables. Alors, pourquoi politique fiscale et politique de dépenses qui sont inappropriées? En Algérie, on a les moyens, on avait les moyens de nous en sortir. Si on avait mené des politiques de recettes et des politiques de dépenses plus appropriées qu'elles ne l'ont été. La première, c'est que nous avons des marges de manœuvre en termes de fiscalité aux hydrocarbures qui sont énormes. D'abord en termes de subventions implicites. L'énergie, le pétrole et le gaz sont vendus sur le marché domestique à un prix 5 fois inférieur à celui du marché international. C'est des subventions implicites. Si l'entreprise nationale des hydrocarbures vendait le pétrole et le gaz au prix international, la fiscalité pétrolière qui reviendrait à l'État serait de 12 milliards de dollars par an. 12 milliards de dollars par an. Donc il y a là un gisement de fiscalité qui est absolument énorme. Le deuxième gisement de fiscalité, c'est que, mais ça c'est commun à tous les pays africains, je pense, à tous les pays d'Afrique, c'est l'informel. Il y a trop d'informel dans nos pays, de sorte que chez nous, les impôts indirects sont inférieurs aux impôts directs. C'est-à-dire que tout ce qui est impôt sur les revenus sont supérieurs aux impôts sur la TVA, etc., aux impôts indirects. Alors que c'était l'inverse au début des années 2000. Maintenant, la courbe s'est inversée parce qu'il y a trop d'informels, il n'y a pas assez de paiement de la TVA. Donc, un meilleur recouvrement fiscal et des politiques qui chercheraient à résorber, pas à lutter simplement contre l'informel, mais à résorber des politiques intelligentes, des politiques efficaces qui permettraient de résorber cet informel et donc de lutter contre l'évasion fiscale. Ça, c'est du côté des dépenses. En matière de dépenses, il faut absolument... les dépenses publiques, il faut qu'elles soient efficaces. Or, quand on fait de la dépense publique, surtout d'infrastructures, on ne cherche pas souvent cette efficacité. On ne la cherche pas souvent. L'efficacité, ça veut dire qu'il faut regarder quel est son impact sur la croissance. Il faut des dépenses qui soient rentables socialement. Or, on n'a jamais fait ça. L'exemple type un petit peu, c'est qu'on a fait, les autorités ont décidé, l'ancien président a décidé de construire une mosquée, une des plus grandes d'Afrique, sinon la plus grande, qui a coûté quand même quelque chose comme 3 milliards de dollars. Au minimum 3 milliards de dollars. Avons-nous besoin réellement de ça? Et ce qui, non seulement il n'y a pas d'impact sur la croissance future, mais elle va entraîner des coûts supplémentaires dans le budget de fonctionnement. Voilà le type même de dépenses, de prestige, mais qui ont des conséquences par la suite. Ensuite, la gestion des projets d'infrastructure, c'est là où les financements des institutions financières internationales sont intéressantes, parce que non seulement il y a des financements, mais en même temps, il y a ce suivi-là, il y a cette expertise-là qui permet d'éviter les surcoûts, qui permet d'éviter la corruption, qui permet d'éviter, etc., etc. Voilà, Monsieur le Président, rapidement ce que je voulais dire sur la gestion de la dette de mon pays. Voilà.
Thank you very much. This session was supposed to end at 12:10, so we have gone 10 minutes beyond the time. Can I take guidance from the Master of Ceremony? Five. So 5 minutes, I will allow very short comments from the floor. Yes. I will take you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief because I don't have much time. We thank the Central Bank of Rwanda for the warm hospitality. I want to say quickly that debt is the result of fiscal policy. And if you look at the dynamics of debt today, you have domestic and external debt. And if you look at domestic, it has a lot of implications for the financial sector because, for example, treasury bills and also the bonds are held by our banks. Significant proportion of that is held by our banks. So that has implications of financial stability in case government defaults. Also, if you look at the domestic debt also, you have the SOEs, that is state-owned enterprises. These are also posing significant risk to government. So this is also an area where they borrow and they cannot pay the financial sector. Government has to take over. This happens in my country, for example. Government had to take over the debt. The other one is domestic arrears, which also are significant. These also pose significant fiscal risks. They buy, for example, vehicles from private sector and they don't pay. Some of these things are not even transparent. They come out later. And this also is a major challenge. The other one is cross areas. you have an electricity owing the telecommunication owing the electricity. So all these things need to come out. Of course, debt data also is another thing. Sometimes you find that it is not very, you have problems with the data, and sometimes debt will fall due, but it's not known to them, and then you build areas even without intentionally building them. Now, what needs to be done more is reforming the budget and ensure that the budget is sustainable. That is very, very important. If the budget is not sustainable, it becomes very difficult to ensure that the debt is sustainable. Now, in short, I want to conclude by saying that if you have a debt that is not sustainable, your ability to handle financial crisis also becomes very, very challenging for you. Because we've seen in the last financial crisis that debt went up because you have to do a lot of bailouts. So if you don't have space in your budget, your debt is not sustainable. It becomes challenging to handle financial crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we agree that since the topics today are quite interconnected, probably the questions and the contributions that will come in the next sessions will address some of, most of the issues that we need to address now. I'll therefore take this time to thank very much our distinguished speakers for setting the ball rolling and provoking the minds, and our panelists for adding to the fuel so that in subsequent presentations, more ideas will be provoked. Thank you very much. Thank you again to our distinguished speakers and panelists.
Thank you, Professor Luoga. Now, what's about to happen now is we will stay seated as our guest of honor, the Right Honorable Prime Minister, and the other VIPs exit the room through that door over there. So I'll just mention who goes through there to go for the official photo. It will be all governors, ministers, vice governors, and all speakers. So they will all exit through that door over there. The protocol team is there to help you and guide you towards the photo, the official photo. The VIPs will be those ones I just mentioned. Governor, vice governor, ministers, and all speakers will also be having their coffee break on that side. For everybody else, let's just stay seated in the meantime before we exit through this door on my right to go for the regular coffee break. If we could just give a hand of applause to our VIPs as they exit the door, please. Thank you. Again, governors, vice governors, ministers, and all speakers. Everybody else, please stay seated.